Well, if there are any kids here, you are welcome to go to Children's Church at this time, and I know that some folks are going to be meeting with you out in our cafe, just out through these doors. And I'm sorry, but Miss Mia had to go home sick this morning, so if you would say a little prayer in your heart for Miss Mia, I'm sure she'll be feeling better soon. But she said that she was really sad to have to go, but she had to leave between services this morning. So go ahead, go this way, guys, out these side doors here. There you go. You can follow Mr. Andrew. He's waving at you. Thank you, Mr. Andrew. Our reading this morning is from the Gospel according to Luke, from the 23rd chapter. I'll be starting in verse 32 and ending in verse 35. Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus. There, with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Messiah, God, his chosen one." Let me read that last verse one more time, verse 35. And the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Last weekend, as you heard, we were at St. Simon's Island. Beautiful place to visit, place that has some Methodist history, stayed at a lovely conference center. And on Sunday morning, we took the opportunity to go to worship at a sister United Methodist church. And there's a few options on the island, so that was kind of fun. We went to a beautiful church, experienced wonderful hospitality. They had a terrific band and a strong sermon that morning. But I have a confession for you, and the confirmands probably don't know this. But during that sermon, I sort of spaced out a little bit. I mean, I spaced out a lot of it. Now, maybe it was all of the details of the confirmation trip and wanting to make sure that we were ready for the next thing after that. Maybe it was the constant little head counting that I was always doing all the time to make sure that we had everybody in our group and everybody was accounted for. And maybe it was just my mind started to wander with all of the other stuff that was going on in my life and in the world around me, and I just got distracted. But it was one of those things where I kind of came back to a few moments later and realized that I had missed a chunk of the sermon, and I had to get back on track again and realized that I had just gone off into La La Land for a little bit. Now, I know this is never something that you've never experienced at this church, so you probably can't relate exactly, but that's what happens, and the fact of the matter is that it does happen. It happens to all of us, and it doesn't happen intentionally, it just kind of does. We get comfortable with what is familiar, we get comfortable with routine, and then little by little, we just sort of drift away into our own thoughts and get distracted for a moment. And maybe we come back, hopefully we come back, get back online, but there's that chance that we just lose it for a little bit before coming back to our focused, careful, considerate place of worship. Now, let's just hold that for just a second, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But I am concerned that what happens is we start in this intentional place and we move into a far more passive kind of role. So we're starting a new sermon series today, as you probably gathered from the video, and from those of you who are in our small groups, you know that we are reading a new book. All of our small groups are actually participating in it, and it's called Witness at the Cross by Amy Jill Levine, who teaches at Vanderbilt. Now, it's interesting that she chose the title Witness at the Cross instead of Witnesses, because I think then we have a double meaning in the title, Witness at the Cross. But really what she spends a lot of time doing is talking about the witnesses, the people in the Bible, in the biblical stories, who were present at the crucifixion. And that's sort of a new thing for me, at least in the season of Lent. I mean, we do this in Advent, right? As we prepare for Christmas, you've heard tons of sermons and sermon series and read books and scores of daily devotional meditations about imagine what the shepherds were going through, or imagine if you were one of the wise men, or imagine if you were Mary or Joseph, or hearing the angel's news, that kind of thing. We do that a lot in Advent when we try to put ourselves into the shoes of somebody in the biblical story, but we don't do that as much when it comes to the season of Lent as we prepare for Good Friday and Easter. So that's what this book does. It asks us to be the witnesses and bearing witness from our experience at the cross. And so that's what we're doing for the next few weeks. And today, the first chapter in the book is sort of an interesting one. This is the story about the people who are not some of the main players, the main figures in the story. Later on, we'll get to the men crucified on Jesus' right and left. We'll get to the Marys and the other women who are gathered there and so forth. But today is sort of, well, if the crucifixion was a play, these would be the people cast as the townsfolk, right? These are the extras on stage. And so they have a role to play. They're there, they're present, but we don't know much about who they are, what their story is, or if they even have a line in the play. And so what's interesting is that Amy Jill Levine talks about how, depending on the gospel account, the townsfolk have different roles. So if you look at Matthew and Mark's account, these are people who are there and they're angry. They're angry at Jesus because they have recently heard him say the comment, "The temple will be torn down and 3 days later built again." Now we know, and perhaps some other people know, that Jesus is actually talking about himself. He's using a metaphor. He's talking about himself. If the temple is the indwelling of God's holy place on earth, then we today now know that to be Jesus. So when he says the temple is going to be torn down, he's referring to his crucifixion on Good Friday, and 3 days later on Easter Sunday, he will rise again. But this is one of these great examples that the Bible talks about. Not always is the Bible meant to be interpreted literally here, because Jesus is speaking figuratively. And so he says that the temple is going to be torn down, but the people who heard this literally are saying, "How dare you say something so outrageous? That's a crime against our faith, right? And to be rebuilt in 3 days, that's preposterous. This has taken generations to build. It's not going to be rebuilt in 3 days after it's torn down." And so there are people there in Matthew and in Mark's account who say, "You said that about the temple, that alone should be punishable by death. So you deserve what you are getting," and they mock him and they chastise him while he is on the cross. But Luke's account that I just read to you from, and I read verse 35 twice, because all it says about the townspeople is that they were silent. They were present, but they didn't say anything. They were simply bystanders. Now, we can go back in current events and in history and even times in our own life when we have been very uncomfortable with the role of bystanders who stood passively by. How come they didn't intervene in that? That could have been avoided had somebody spoken up. How come the mob mentality took over instead of, all it would take is one person to do the right thing? And we ask ourselves these kind of questions. And then it's easy, though, to point fingers until we're in one of those roles one day and we find ourselves in a situation and we say, "Yeah, I don't really want to get involved. I could get hurt. The people I love could be impacted. Or this could risk damaging my reputation. So I'm not going to throw my lot in. I'm just going to stay here and be a passive bystander." So as I was thinking about this first chapter in the book and thinking about these bystanders, these townspeople that really are there not doing much of anything. In fact, Luke makes a point of mentioning them, but then saying that they just say nothing. That sort of speaks volumes. And as I think about people like Pharisees and Sadducees and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene and John, all at the foot of the cross, I think about them and I think it's hard to imagine myself in their shoes. But you know what I can do? I can picture myself as a bystander. And I can think of myself as a bystander who maybe in that moment chose to be a passive observer. So the fact of the matter is that I think that the bystanders who do nothing are some of the people who deserve maybe the harshest critique in all of this story, because at least the other people, including the townspeople in Matthew and Mark's account, at least they're passionate enough to say something, right? They believe that Jesus, this is not about whether they're right or wrong, but at least they feel strongly about it. They're deeply convicted in their faith, and they say, if you say that about the temple, well, that's a crime that needs to be punished. Good for them for at least being passionate about their faith. But the bystanders, the fence sitters, where do they stand? They're lukewarm. And when I think about it, I guess I wonder how many of us could probably identify with the lukewarm bystanders who remain silent, who take a passive role, maybe more easily than we could identify with the other characters. This is not meant to be a condemnation. It's just the reality, right? This is what happens is we slide into this sort of place where it's easy to become bystanders in our own faith because things become predictable. We maybe, lose focus during a sermon. Yeah, okay, fine, that's understandable. It's one person talking for 20, 30 minutes. But what about all the times that we're reading our Bible and we get several pages through, we finish the chapter and then think back, I have no idea what I just read. What about all the times that we're praying and our prayer becomes thinking about something else, a to-do list, what we're going to do after we finish the prayer, what's going on later in the day, and we get distracted? What about all the times that we take that passive role in our faith and just let faith come to us instead of being active participants, instead of being proactive, instead of being engaged? And this is, we talk about distractions, and yeah, we live in a culture of constant distractions, but this is not a new idea. In fact, ancient Christians knew that this was a problem. And before them, ancient Jews knew that this was a problem. In fact, in ancient Judaism, there is a Hebrew word called kavanah, which is the idea that you need to combat the natural tendencies to drift off into La La Land. And so a kavanah type Jewish and Christian faith is one where we say, if I'm in it, I'm all in it. I'm focused. If I'm gonna pray, I'm gonna pray sincerely. I'm gonna pray with focus. If I'm gonna attend worship, I'm not gonna just go through the motions. I'm going to enter into it. If I'm going to read through the scriptures, I'm going to try to let the scriptures speak to me and understand it as best as I can and be an active reader in that process. There was once a famous rabbi who talked about this whole practice, and he said, if you don't practice something to be transformed, then you are not practicing it with kavanah. So the idea then is that we need to enter into this practice in a different way. And I think that this season of Lent provides an incredible opportunity where the church calendar, this church's tradition, has set aside a time period that says, we know that you have probably floated off a little bit. It's time to recenter. Let's talk about what this faith tradition is all about. Let's talk about what really matters. Let's put ashes on our forehead, if that's not a powerful enough sign, that we are in need of God's grace, that we are dependent on God, that we are created out of the breath of God's lungs, out of the soil of this earth, and that is where we will return one day. And thanks be to God we have Jesus Christ to write a new chapter in that story. But this season is supposed to hold in tension the joy of coming together for worship on Sundays, which we call miniature Easters, and the rest of the week in the season of Lent, which is meant to be very deeply introspective. We're supposed to consider our mortality. We're supposed to wrestle with the hard things. We're supposed to talk about the unpleasant story of Jesus' betrayal, death, crucifixion, and put in the tomb. And if we do that, if we approach Lent with a kavana type of approach to our faith in this season, then the hope is that the transformation will occur so that Easter will be a more powerful Easter than we have ever experienced. But in order for that to be the case, we have got to invest in it now. We have got to be intentional. We have got to give purpose to everything that we do for the next 40 days. Confirmands. It has been very easy for many of you through this far in your life to take faith as it comes to you. You have inherited the faith that your parents or your grandparents or your family passed on to you. And so you have taken what has been offered. But this is the point that we start a new chapter. This is a new day for you. Because at this moment today, you made a declaration that said, I am confirming what was done for me years ago in my baptism, and now I am taking that on myself. You are now in the driver's seat. You are not passive participants in your Christian faith. This is now when you get to have some more control of your faith, of your story, claiming this on your own. Too many times I think we make this association where we say confirmation should be like graduation. Like, hey, we've accomplished this thing. Now we're done. We can put our feet up. When in reality, confirmation is more like turning 16 and you are given the keys. This is when it gets interesting. This is when it gets exciting. This is when the faith is yours to explore, to continue to ask the questions, to read the Bible for yourself. You have the foundation. You have the grounding. You have the framework now to take this and run with it. This is when you go deeper. This is when your faith really takes off and becomes alive in a way that it hasn't been able to before because you have been a child and now you are a more mature person and you're able to ask these questions, process these things, grow deeper in relationship to God. And if you approach your confirmation as a kavana type of experience, then what happens from here is that everything else that you do with intentionality, believing that when I read Scripture, when I pray, when I worship, when I serve others, when I conduct myself as a Christian in the world around me, it has a transformative power. Everybody else, you got to participate in the confirmation liturgy today. You responded as a church family, as blood family, sharing in this experience with our confirmands. And may this be a reminder too, as you remembered your own baptismal vows. You may remember your own confirmation, and you remembered that this is a moment of intentionality, where we say, today is a new beginning for us. We write this new chapter where we take our faith, we look at it and said, that is something I am willing to stand by, instead of being a bystander. We are not bystanders at the cross. We are witnesses at the cross. So may we go forward from here for the next 40 days and then well beyond Easter as a people who seek transformation, renewal, and a new kind of hope because we have claimed Jesus as our Savior. Will you pray with me?